If for some reason book lovers were cast into the Fade in Dragon Age Inquisition, and we had to go up against the nightmare demon who brings to life our deepest fears, I am fairly certain that for a lot of us, our deepest fears that would be replayed for us is probably terrible adaptations of our favorite stories, of which there would be a lot of them. It's why every time I hear news about a favorite story of mine being adapted, rather than leap for joy and be thankful for the news, I feel a strong sense of dread, born by years of conditioned disappointment in the art of how much further would studios sink to in ruining my favorite stories. And Netflix is particularly guilty of this. Please refer to my reaction video of the travesty that was their Persuasion. So yeah, I was terrified because The Sandman is one of my favorite comics of all time. From the day I read all 75 issues some 15 years ago, The Sandman has been a story that has held my heart and nourished my soul. Dream was a character I half wanted to shake, half wanted to shout at, and for whom I was inconsolable at the end of the comics. It is a comic I've reached for repeatedly in almost 2 decades. When I lost my dad almost 10 years ago, the sound of her wings got me out of bed and encouraged me to keep living. So needless to say, I have been holding my breath since the news was made about the adaptation. I didn't allow myself to hope even after Neil Gaiman informed us that he was going to be quite hands-on in bringing the adaptation to screen. I figured time would confirm if truly Netflix was about to ruin one of my favorite stories, or if by some miracles they wouldn't. And what do you know? Miracles don't just happen on the 34th Street, because The Sandman was released on Netflix and I binged it in less than 24 hours. I'd initially told myself that if the adaptation turned out great, I would watch it in slow sips and pace myself all through the weekend, but alas, I'd been so parched and was absolutely greedy for an adaptation that would not only keep the spirit of the story it was adapting, but bring every element of it to such vivid life that I would be dreaming about it long after I'd finished, that I guzzled it all down. But here is when I knew that not only was this adaptation phenomenal, but that I also had to make a somewhat incoherent review about it. The minute the last of the credits rolled, I restarted it all over again. It is just that good. But before we get into all that, what is The Sandman about? The Sandman follows Dream of the Endless, also called Morpheus, who is the eponymous hero of our comic. Is the Endless who rules over the realm of dreams, and when some humans who wanted to capture death accidentally capture Dream instead, Dream is imprisoned for decades, which sets off an interconnected chain of events that reverberates throughout the entire story. But in as much as the story is about Dream, a being that is obviously not human, the story is also about humans, our fears and hopes and dreams and desires, our frailties and strength, vindictiveness and forgiveness and purpose. It's about life and death, despair and hope, creation and destruction, destiny and the autonomy of our choices, the delight in our existence and the delirium of our coping mechanisms. It is a story that would have you thinking and questioning and laughing and crying and dancing and screaming. It is fantastic. If you haven't read the Sandman comics yet, you totally should. And as you might have guessed from all I have to say about the Sandman comics, Netflix Sandman had big shoes to fill as an adaptation, and it was how they went about filling those shoes that led to the success of this adaptation, starting with the fact that the creators had a clear story in mind when they set about making this first season. Now, what do I mean by that? It is clear that the creators of this show, in fleshing out the season, wanted to tell a complete story of Dream being captured, escaping, and attempting to reclaim his power and the pieces of his domain that had escaped either prior to his imprisonment or during his imprisonment, all of which was contained within the first 16 volumes that was split into the 2 books, Preludes and Nocturnes and The Doll's House. You can see from the narrative choices made throughout the season that it was clear from the jump to the creators that that was where they wanted to end the season. They had a clear view of how the season should end and didn't attempt to cram extra books or content or characters into the season, which helped to not make season 1 bloated and also helped Sandman retain the fable-like quality of its storytelling. That was one of the things I was terrified about losing in the adaptation, because the beauty of Sandman is just that, how the story wanders but finds its way back home. And it is because of this clarity that makes it easy for non-readers of the comic to get the story. I have spoken to quite a number of my colleagues who aren't comic readers, whose only relationship with the comics is the tattoo of the Endless's sigils that I have tattooed on my right calf, and yet, even though they don't have any prior engagement with the source material, They get it. It's an adaptation without any wasted moments or a sense of filling the gapness that a lot of adaptations are guilty of. You don't get the sense that because you haven't read the source material, you are missing bits of the story, or you can't understand the characters or what the story is about. Instead, it is done in such a way that people familiar with the story are delighted with the narrative choices, and people not familiar with it are engrossed in the story being told, which is honestly brilliant. And because you can tell that the writers already knew where the story was going and what they wanted to say, it meant they made certain narrative choices that actually worked with the story being told. I am of course referring to the humanization of Dream, who was played quite amazingly by Tom Sturridge. The Dream we have in the comic, especially at the start of the story and for a lot of the volumes, is quite disconnected from his emotions, as is expected from an embodiment of the concept of dreams. There's just something distant in the way he relates with the world around him that is so indifferent and cold that when it starts to thaw and when we finally meet Daniel Hall post the kindly ones, it's quite the cathartic, bittersweet feeling. And it is clear that the showrunners and writers for Netflix's Sandman were going for that feeling of catharsis, because Tom Sturridge's Dream had more emotions than Dream in the comics at this point of the story. And although some people might have a problem with that, I don't, because clearly a deliberate choice was made to make him way more human quite early in the portrayal, so that by the events of episode 10, we feel more connected to this Dream. We understand the thoughts and emotions going through his head that he otherwise would not have let us be privy to. We are able to root for him, to hope that he's able to find a solution and that the Corinthian doesn't succeed. It's funny how just by making Dream more human in this season of the Sandman, I found myself wanting to throttle him way less in this adaptation than in the comics, and I absolutely loved it. I also loved how Brute and Glob were merged into Galt in the adaptation, and how both the reason for Galt's decision and the ending she was given was changed from the comic, as it fit better with this more human characterization of Dream, and also the fact that change is something that happens to all things, whether they be a concept, a human, or a nightmare. Our roles aren't predestined or fixed. They can be changed. We see this through the comics, and I really loved how it was made real in the show, and how, like I said, it tied it back to this version of the story without trying to force things. It's the same reason why I wasn't mad at the choice to not force Alex Burgess into an endless nightmare as was done in the comics. Sure, he's forced into an unending dream, but it isn't a nightmare, because the Alex of the show is different from comic Alex. He's more apologetic towards Dream. He clearly feels terrible about his father capturing it, and he doesn't try to bargain for immortality like his comic counterpart did. So yeah, I love the change and how they maintained that thread all through the story. Still speaking on things I love that made this a stellar adaptation, the casting. The casting was so spot on. I honestly want everyone involved in the production of The Sandman to give the rest of the world a tutorial on how to cast actors for book to movie or show adaptations, because the casting director for this show understood the assignment. Tom Sturridge as Dream was just excellent. It brought the mopey, melancholic majesty of Dream of the Endless to life so brilliantly well. I was screaming at my TV, yes, that's Dream. I also think that the casting of Kirby Orwell Baptiste as Death was heaven sent. She brought that laid back, chill, wanna hang, but also I'm Death of the Endless vibe to the character, and it was just divine. I've said it quite a number of times on this channel that Death of the Endless is my favorite depiction of death in literature. I love her. It was because of her that I was able to deal with my dad passing, because I pictured her being present at his bedside to lead him away when his time came. And just seeing Kirby Orwell Baptiste bring her to life with that strength and grace and joy and vibrancy, I was ecstatic. Then there's Mason Alexander Park as Desire, David Thewlis as John Dee, Vanusu Samunya as Rose Walker, and God, Stephen Fry as Gilbert, and you know who. I mean, he was perfect for the character. Boyd Holbrook as the Corinthian, although if I'm being honest, I do think the Corinthian was more terrifying in the comics, but that has nothing to do with Boyd's portrayal, because he played the charming, murdering nightmare serial killer to a T. I think my fault with the Corinthian in the show was probably the visual effects. I didn't get the horror of the teeth for eyes the same way I got it in the comics, which is a shame, to be quite honest. And still speaking of things that they could have done better, the on-screen adaptation of the 24 Hours issue, drawn brilliantly well by Mike Dringenberg, was disturbing and terrifying and horrifying, and went off for long enough that I found myself incapable of speaking or looking away from the horror that was happening across the page. It was uncomfortable in a way that I felt the despair and pain and madness of the characters, and just like the events stretched endlessly long for them, it stretched for me as well. That by the end of the issue, I was spent, and although David Thewlis was brilliant in the role, like I said, and the 24/7 episode was good, I didn't find myself quite as drained as I felt every time I read that issue in the comic, and I think it's because the adaptation didn't approach the issue the way the comic did. The comic took us on a 24-hour spree that had a whole gamut of emotions, and the show interpreted the 24 hours as a 24/7 diner instead, which meant that the way the concept of time contributed to the fatigue and madness of these characters, acting like marionettes to fulfill the desire of John Dee's forced truth, and the fatigue of us, the readers, going through that with them, was lost because the events of the diner didn't take that stretch of time. I still think that the episode was good, but I'm just a little bit sad that it could have been great. But honestly, that is just me nitpicking. The show is a solid 9.5 stars for me. I love every moment of it. My favorite episode will always be The Sound of Our Wings, because that is my favorite issue in the comics, and like I said, I'm still here today because of that issue. And it was done so brilliantly well for the screen. I cried so hard, but it was cathartic tears, and I don't regret it one bit. But back to what I was saying, if you haven't seen Sandman yet, you absolutely should. The 10 episodes will pass by pretty quickly, and it's a show that would stay with you and have you rewatching it over and over again. So if you have seen it before, then please rewatch it like I have. And in an era where we've gotten the most horrendous adaptations, The Sandman is a breath of fresh air that everyone should be breathing right now.